A common belief among creationists who promote intelligent design is that every living thing on Earth, in fact, has been created by a designer. The argument I will oppose is that there is a certain moth called the Morgan's Sphinx moth that so happens to have a proboscis that is the perfect match with the Darwin's orchid. The argument states that the two must have been created by a designer at the same time in order to be able to serve their purposes, or otherwise they would not be able to stay alive. In order to understand why this statement is incorrect, and why evolution in fact is the cause of this, we need to understand how pollination works. In the majority of all cases, pollination requires pollinators, the animals carrying the pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another. Some flowers do self-pollinate, which means no other organisms are involved in the pollination. In this specific case, the moth talked about is an insect, and the course of pollination is called entomophily, which is the act of pollination by insects. Organisms co-evolve with many species at the same time, because an environment includes many different types of organisms. So as the insects change, so did the orchids which were dependent upon them. This has led to an incredible amount of diversity in the 25,000 to 30,000 species of orchids that exist today. But the orchids did not just evolve with the insects who feed off of them today. The reason why the orchid and the moth were not created by a designer, but in fact co-evolved together, is that they were never created for each other from the beginning. As previously said, scientists had found orchids from about 80 million years ago, and those orchids were self-pollinating. So when the orchids and the insects started a symbiotic relation, it was not only the moth who fed and pollinated the orchids, but in fact many different insects. Over a time lapse of more than 60 million years, the two organisms who stayed together and evolved were the Morgan's Sphinx moth and the Darwin's orchid. The opposing argument says at one point, quote, that there are thousands of creations who would never evolve, because in order for them to serve their purpose, they would all have this need to be together, all at one time. You remove one component, it all ceases to work. End quote. Yes, that is somewhat correct. If by somehow either the orchid or the moth were to be removed and killed, the other would not survive. They are dependent on each other today, but only because they have had millions of years to evolve together. They were never created for each other to start off with. Later in this video, the speaker talks about how evolution is false because it does not allow organisms to evolve to their best potential. Many animals found as fossils from 150 million years ago are still alive and look the exact same way today. Sharks, alligators, and the horseshoe crab are some to name a few. What is important to remember when it comes to evolution and Darwin's theory are the keywords survival of the fittest. That does not mean survival of the organism who can evolve the best, but the organism that has evolved the best in order to survive with the conditions it lives in right now. Evolution doesn't strive to create the strongest, fastest, or biggest animals, but just strong, fast, and big enough to survive. If a designer would have created the organisms, wouldn't the designer already have made the living creatures the strongest, the fastest, or the biggest? And that is why intelligent design is false.